Welcome to the lecture for Unit 14, Grouping and Differentiation. This lecture will cover the following topics. What is differentiation? Why should we differentiate? And how do we differentiate for different students? First, let's clarify some terms. When we say in-class ability grouping, we're talking about groups that are arranged according to ability within the same classroom. Groups may be grouped by homogeneous, same ability, or heterogeneous, different ability. If you're grouping students that have the same reading level together, for example, you are grouping homogeneously. If you group students with different reading ability levels together, you are grouping heterogeneously. In-class ability grouping, homogeneous grouping that is, it's generally good for students, depending on how it's done. Between class ability grouping is when groups are arranged according to ability level across classes. This is usually done homogeneously grouping or grouping students with the same ability together. For example, if a school administers a math test to fifth graders and then sends those students out to different classes based on their ability levels, that is between class ability grouping. This again is generally good for students depending on how it's done. Tracking is when we place students into a track that's fairly permanent and they take courses based on their abilities. This usually utilizes between class ability grouping. However, the difference is this is more or less permanent. Generally, this is bad for students and may have racist implications if it's done poorly. The reason for this is there have been studies which have produced evidence that Black and Hispanic students have been tracked into lower tracks without careful consideration of their abilities. This is bad for students. Differentiation, which is the subject of this lecture, simply means matching the given content with a student's interest, abilities, and learning styles through various instructional strategies. The benefit of differentiation is that it's flexible. Students are not tracked into one track. Rather, grouping is flexible and flows based on an individual's needs. This usually takes place within class grouping, and it's generally good for students. This lecture will explore differentiation. First, a definition for differentiation. Differentiation is matching the given content, what you teach students, with their interest, abilities, and learning styles through various instructional strategies. Sally Reese, University of Connecticut. This means that you must become aware of what your students are capable of. That is, you must understand where they are on their ladder of learning. We've talked about Vygotsky in this course. We've portrayed learning as a ladder. First you stand on the first rung, and then you go to the next rung and the next rung, and so forth. Picture your students at different rungs on these ladders. Differentiation allows you to meet the students where they're at on each of their rungs to help them progress to the next rung. Why should you differentiate? You should differentiate because, like the pants in this picture, one size does not fit all. We learned last week that students are different in many different ways. This week, we're going to consider some ways to differentiate. It's important to understand that you can differentiate for both ends of the spectrum, students who are struggling, but also students who have mastered the objective. Why should you care about differentiating for students who have already mastered the objective before you begin teaching? I like to think that a student has a right to learn something new every day. Differentiating for the advanced students allows them to continue to learn. I like this cartoon because it depicts what most teachers think of as differentiating. Why aren't you differentiating? However, be reassured that it doesn't have to be like this. What does the research on differentiation say? The research on differentiation is overwhelmingly positive. Students learn more, they produce more when differentiation is employed. They're more creative, they develop better study habits. They interact with each other better socially. There's more cooperation in the classroom. Students' attitudes improve and they are more motivated towards school. And finally, there's less negative impact with poorly matched tasks. One of the reasons that students get frustrated with learning is when the learning doesn't match that level where they're at. A word of caution. Differentiation for advanced student is not about giving them more work. It's about giving them more challenging work, but not more work. Differentiation for struggling students is not about dumbing down the curriculum. We want to avoid these two pitfalls when we start to talk about how to differentiate work for these two groups. A final word of caution. Do not use advanced students as tutors for other students. It might be tempting to think that because these students have mastered learning objectives, it would be appropriate to send them over to other students to help out. However, they're not teaching assistants. They have a right to learn and advance their own knowledge. Therefore, differentiation helps you address this need in a more productive way. Is it fair to give different students different work? I invite you to consider this cartoon. Here we see animals lined up in front of a tree, and a teacher or a judge says, "For fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree." Look at the animals' expressions. The monkey is delighted because he knows he's more than capable of climbing the tree. The elephant is shocked and surprised, as is the penguin. And what chance does the poor fish have of climbing the tree? He can't even get out of the water. Our educational system is a little bit like this. When we insist that everyone do the same task, we are advantaging some and disadvantaging others. Differentiation makes the learning fair because it meets every child where they're at on their terms of their learning needs. What does differentiation look like in the classroom? Here are some simple things that you might see. You might see a consistent use of pretesting. You might see a decrease in large group or whole classroom activities and a corresponding increase in small group activities. You might see an increase in individual alternatives in centers, homeworks, and learning contracts. One thing that differentiation is not is that it's not about creating individual lesson plans for every child. You wouldn't have time to do that or to carry it out. There are 4 steps to differentiate learning. Number 1, you must pre-assess for knowledge or skills that you are about to teach. Let's say you're about to teach a unit on mammals. The first step is to pre-assess to see what your class knows about mammals. This, of course, would be ungraded because you haven't taught them anything. Step 2 is to divide the class into 2 or 3 groups. You might divide them into students who know very little or nothing, students who know some, and students who know a lot. Some teachers cut that down to 2 groups, students who have not mastered the learning objectives and students who have. The third step is to differentiate lessons by content, process, or product, or interests. We'll be talking about these later in the lecture. Finally, just as with all instruction, after the teaching, you must assess students for what they have learned. And that is when you would possibly grade the assessment. Let's discuss step 1 in more depth, pre-assess students. Pre-assessment should be conducted prior to starting any new area of study. Frequently, teachers will pre-assess at the start of a unit. These are connected to the learning objectives and are usually done at the beginning of a unit or a theme. At times, they also may be conducted prior to the day's lesson. It's really up to you when and how frequently you want to pre-assess students on what will be taught. Here are some examples. In science, before beginning a unit, students create a concept map showing what they know about an upcoming unit, such as space. In social studies, students complete a brief multiple choice pre-assessment prior to beginning a unit on the Civil War. And in language arts, students indicate which novel they would prefer to read out of several choices. This last example is when you want to when you want to differentiate according to interest. As I said before, in all cases, reassure students that this pre-assessment is ungraded and given for the purpose of helping you understand where they are in their learning. Step 2 is to plan and implement differentiated instruction. You can differentiate instruction through content, what is taught, the process, how students learn, or the product, what students will produce. Let's talk about a little bit more about differentiation by content. This is changing what students are taught. You can modify the learning objectives to make them simpler or more complex, but be careful. You want to avoid dumbing down the curriculum. You might provide more or less support or scaffolding on assignments. For students who are struggling, for example, you might give handwritten notes, or you might highlight passages of a text that are particularly important to pay attention to, and you might leave that out for other students. You might vary the reading level on assigned materials. Give harder readings that cover more detail to advanced groups, and similarly give simpler readings to less advanced groups. This is all differentiation by content. Let's take a look at some things that refer to content differentiation. You might differentiate what standards are taught. You might differentiate the concepts that are taught. In other words, what students will know, what they will understand, and what they will be able to do. Let's talk a little more about differentiating by process. You could vary the activities each group does. Offer simpler activities with more instructions and support for struggling students. Offer more challenging activities to advanced groups. Offer a variety of formats for learning. For example, listening, writing, reading, to incorporate students' preferences. So for example, you might have one group listening to a story and another group writing a story. Learning may be differentiated by process. You can do flexible types of grouping, changing the groups around according to the learning needs. You can do think, pair, shares, or simulations. You can do learning contracts, tiered assignments, where one student does an assignment one way and another student does it another way. All of these might differ from student group to student group. If you change the way something is taught, but you're teaching the same thing, that's differentiation by process. Let's discuss for a moment differentiating by products in a little more depth. You might provide multiple ways that students can demonstrate learning throughout the semester. They might, for example, write papers, or they might do a PowerPoint. Another group might choose to do a skit. This is really the area where you can allow a lot of student interest and student choice, which students do appreciate. You might differentiate by product. Students might, in different groups, produce a different product. This is after the learning occurs. One student's group might choose to do a timeline. Another might choose to do a poster. Another might choose to do an essay. If students produce something different at the end of learning, they will be doing differentiation by product. The next step is to assess. Assess what has been taught. This may mean you need to develop different assessments for different students. It wouldn't make sense to give the same test to all students if you're teaching them different things. So it's okay to give different assessments. Here's a summary of what we have covered in this lecture. Differentiation is about matching given content with a student's interests, abilities, and learning styles through various instructional strategies. It's not the same as tracking. Research on differentiation suggests it is positive for students both academically and social-emotionally. We don't need to design individualized lesson plans for students. Effective differentiation may be done through content, process, or product. You may also differentiate by allowing student choice. This is differentiation by student interest. I hope this lecture has helped you understand differentiation.